Welcome everyone to Counter Hegemony. My name is Aaron Taus. Colombia has been rocked by a bloody armed conflict for more than 6 decades. The overwhelming majority of the more than 9 million victims are poor peasants. So Colombia's rural areas have always been the principal battlegrounds of the ongoing war. Historically, the political conflict dynamics in the countryside have been closely related to the development and the expansion of capitalism. To find out more about Colombia's peasants and their struggles under neoliberalism, I spoke with Nasir Rishani, professor of political science at Kean University. He's the author of Systems of Violence, the Political Economy of War and Peace in Colombia. Professor Rishani has a new book coming out in August titled Colombian Peasants in the Neoliberal Age. The book is of particular interest in light of Colombia's current political context. For the first time, the country has a leftist government. President Gustavo Petro is a former guerrilla fighter, and his vice president, Francia Marquez, an Afro-Colombian feminist and environmental activist. I started the interview by asking Professor Rishani why studying Colombia's peasants and their struggles is key for understanding the dynamics of the country's armed conflict.
One of the key outcomes of my research in Colombia since 1995, which when I started in Colombia doing research as a Fulbright scholar, and was when we study civil wars from a political economic perspective, then you have to understand the nature of the classes involved in the war, in the social classes, and of course in the Colombian case, as in other cases in the world, the peasantry plays a very important role in conflict, and in the context of Africa as well as in the Middle East and elsewhere, in different forms, of shapes. The peasantry and the rural areas are not only the battlegrounds of civil wars, but also where the local peasant communities are actively involved in civil conflict and civil wars. And when you look further into that question, the class analysis, you find that the focal point is the conflict or the struggle over land, on land access. That's the key point. So the key point is how the dispossession and appropriation of land is taking place by speculators, multinational, and large landowners, and how this process of creeping capitalism into the rural areas, it is the point of departure of many conflicts in the past and in the present in the world. So the whole thing revolves around access to land, and then emphasizes access to land.
In his upcoming book, Professor Rishani tries to explain the link between Colombia's peasants and neoliberal capitalism. So I asked him how he approaches this relationship from a theoretical point of view.
This book, in the forthcoming book, it addresses this question, and brings into the a broader theoretical question, which which in fact builds on Marxist theory, specifically the theory that the components of the theory that Marx developed, which is the capital subsumption, and how capitalism it spreads to the rural areas, subsuming formally or really the pre-capitalist relations So it was a long, of course, Marx looking at the rural question in England, he was exploring this process of subsumption. How does it take place? And how capitalism gradually incorporates the old social structures or social relations into capitalism, but not all. So even in Marx's time, he was keen about even in England. He identified the fact that this doesn't happen uniformly or homogeneously, but rather heterogeneously, and therefore he identified the contradictions in this process, even in England itself, his basic subject. But Marxists misinterpreted Marx, and they started following a developmentalist approach, similar to the one of the mainstream academia, i.e., that there is a unilinear effect of development from capitalism, from feudalism to capitalism, and then from that to hypothetically to socialism. But this is not how it was really theorized by Marx himself. There is no unilinearity in terms of development. There is a complexity in terms of the development, and much more complex than theorized presumably by Marxists or some major trends in Marxism.
The concepts of real and formal subsumption developed by Marx are, however, not the only theoretical building blocks of the book. Professor Ishani has also been drawing on the works of Rosa Luxemburg, in particular on her theory of capitalist expansion.
Another important element which built on the theory of subsumption was developed and quite developed by Rosa Luxemburg. And Rosa Luxemburg looked also on this issue of subsumption and the importance of this process of subsumption to the continuation of the process of accumulation and solving the issues or the basic problem of capitalism, i.e., the issue of overaccumulation and expansionism. So therefore, because by expansion, capitalism is capable of resolving its inner, or not only resolving, but mitigating the inner contradictions of capital itself by expanding. Expanding meaning colonizing more territories and colonizing more people in more areas. So this is where colonialism and imperialism comes into play. That is, capitalism could not grow only within be confined, especially within its national boundaries, but rather it is a continuous project of colonization and imperialism. And but also Rosa Luxemburg acknowledged another component related to this process, that is capitalism, again, doesn't necessarily dismantle all pre-capitalist relations. It does not do that. And the reason why it doesn't do that, it is because the process sometimes of capitalist expansion does not require the dismantling of these relationships, but taking from it what is needed for the capital accumulation process. So therefore, there is it's a peculiar mechanism of absorption, if you wish, but doesn't dismantle all of it. And because it might need, there is no need to dismantle it. It's not conscious. There is no element of agency, rather dialectical process. So therefore, it manages in many aspects to coexist with it and takes from it or absorbs from the pre-capitalist what is needed for the capital accumulation. And in order for me to look at this process, I had to look at it empirically on the ground. And that's what brings me to the Colombian case. So in other words, this is theory, right? But at the empirical level, I had to zero in to see how this dynamic process of subsumption takes place concretely and specifically. And that's why I studied a number of communities, peasant communities in Colombia, and in order to bring the reader more in the relevance of the theory itself of subsumption and its validity in the 21st century, and how does it really empirically applies in a very concrete way on specific cases. And that's what the function of the book is all about, is to bring the theoretical component, builds on it, develops it, i.e. the subsumption component, and tie it in with the specific cases in the Colombian field. That's the idea of the book.
Professor Rishani's book, however, not only analyzes the structural dynamics of capitalism, it also puts a strong emphasis on agency and political action. In the Colombian case, Professor Rishani has studied the peasants' adaptive strategies and their resistance to the dynamics of neoliberal capitalism.
In a way, the book comes with its own contribution in terms of what keeps peasantry alive in the 21st century, which is again, which is against the wishes or even the wishful thinking or even the theories of the developmentalist approaches developed by mainstream academia or some variants of Marxist theories that claim that everything is heading towards capitalism and the pre-capitalist or simple commodity production will disappear in this motion. But it's 200 years later, and we still have peasantry and peasant communities and thriving and developing and adjusting, adapting, and resisting. So therefore, I developed the notion of adaptation and adaptation and resistance and coexistence, maybe are three major components that could explain the continuity of peasant communities globally, including in Europe. So therefore, we do have communities in Europe, the communal life happening and presently still exist in the heart of Europe. So you may as well argue if Europe, if in Europe we still have this phenomenon. Therefore, of course, that means that we are in Asia and Africa and the Middle East and Latin America. We have maybe another 100 years or 200 years. Peasants will continue to be part of the political economy or this landscape of the political global economy. So, and mind you, which is again, it gives you a perspective. The peasant or smallest peasant production, according to the United Nations, the FAO, it's claiming that small peasants of the world today contribute around between 35 to 40% of the food necessities of the world. So therefore, and this is subsistence farming. So when we say subsistence, it doesn't mean they only produce to feed themselves, but also the excess production, they can sell it in the market. So therefore, these small producers are still feeding, or at least percentage-wise, feeding a good chunk of the global population. So that makes it the relevance of the peasantry today in the 21st century more relevant than ever. And that acquires even more relevance when we explore that within that the peasantry, for the most part, they apply sustainable development and ecological principles that conserve the environment and therefore mitigate the effects of climate warming. So therefore it makes the peasantry a leading force in fighting climate change. Therefore, in many ways, the peasantry becomes at the forefront of this fight against global warming.
As I mentioned in the introduction, for the first time in its history, Colombia has a leftist government. So I asked Professor Rishani if the situation for Colombia's peasantry has improved under the Petro government, and if his administration offers an exceptional opportunity for radical policy change to the benefit of small-scale peasants.
It's looking better than before. I must tell you that because the new government of Colombia, the Petro government, as a progressive new government, is finally recognizing we have a government recognizing the importance of the peasantry in Colombia and the importance of the peasantry in resolving the, the endurance of the different types of violences that have engulfed the rural peripheral areas of Colombia since the 19th century. So in other words, because pacifying the rural areas, it requires addressing the grievances of the peasantry. So the entry point of the Petro government was, first and foremost, recognizing the peasantry as a judicial personnel social group, and therefore that passed in the Congress. I think it's amending the article, if I'm not mistaken, it's Article 94 or 64. 1 second, double check. Of the Constitution, recognizing the peasantry as a group that merits the state protection like any other a group or social class. So in essence, this will compel the state not only recognizing the peasantry, but also developing policies to protection of the peasantry. And this brings me to the second point, that is the protection. For instance, now we do have the peasant reserves, reserves in Colombia, and calls for the expansion of these reserves. And the reserves, peasant reserves, it means reservas campesinas. It merits the protection, the legal protection of the state from the incursion of outside actors, including multinational corporations or any agents of capital that tries to penetrate these protected areas, protected lands. So therefore, the peasantry, in a way, it emerges like a quasi semi-sovereign actor within these territories. And it is the peasantry within these zones are calling for to expand the areas of the peasant reserves nationwide. Today we have about 7 reserves, and it might reach, for instance, 1 million hectares of land. And it might increase even further, whereby hundreds of thousands of people presently are benefiting from this type of expansion. And with Petro's government, with the legalizing and protecting these and providing them with legal protection, it allows us to prosper with protecting them a little bit more against the incursion of capital. Capital takes different forms and shapes. We have the multinational corporations, extractive businesses, speculators, and large landowners that all the time they try to take away these lands from the peasants. So it is a long, it is, but these peasants communities and the expansion of their areas of control are examples of how complex the process of subsumption is, bringing again the notion of the theory, and it provides an answer to why peasant communities are still existing, because there is the agency of resistance. The agency of resistance of local actors, meaning the ability to organize and resist the incursion of capital, is a basic characteristic of what makes these communities valid and sustainable up to date. So anyway, the element of agency. As long as the element of agency exists and the capacity of these groups to organize, and it seems that they have it according to the evidence I provided in the book, because their relationships are beyond their national boundaries, and they have expanded their links and connections with multiple peasant organizations globally, which allows them some kind of strategic depth, whereby they exchange experiences, compare notes, know-how, techniques of ecological cultivation and agroeconomy. So all of these things allow peasantry to become politically and technologically and technically more developed and sophisticated. And this allows them to resist even further or enhance their resistance modalities against capitalism.
That does it for today. Thanks to Professor Rishani for the interview and to you for tuning in. Hope you enjoyed. Don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you next time. That does